Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Once again, my name is Michael Granato. For those of you who are joining for the first time, I'm a history and philosophy educator, and I'm going to take some time responding to some videos, a video, I should say, talking about the relationship between science and Christianity and the claim specifically that Christianity is somehow uniquely responsible for the rise of modern science. Now, this video comes from Dr. David Wood, but is a response to a documentary put out by Dr. Jordan Peterson. So I will be responding to Dr. Wood's video about Dr. Peterson's documentary. I would respond directly to the documentary, but it's behind a paywall. And also I'm going to be responding to some of the things that Dr. Wood says, so I feel like responding to his video would be more appropriate in this case. Now, my background specifically relates to a French philosopher named Gaston Bachelard, and I am researching his philosophy of time. In doing so, I'm kind of generally interested in the intersection between the history of philosophy and the history of science. Specifically, what I tell people is the reception of Einsteinian relativity in early 20th century France, but that's really boring and academic and most people lose interest. I do, however, have several videos on my channel kind of addressing my specific academic interest, but I'm also broadly interested in debates and discussions about the relationship between science and Christianity because I'm somewhat familiar with the field and also some of the common mistakes or oversimplifications that I see related to those two subjects. So that's what I'm going to be doing in this video, but I'm going to let Dr. David Wood speak for himself here.
Here's a question for you. Why were all of the pioneers of the scientific revolution Christians of one sort or another? Catholics, Protestants, occasionally a heretic, but they all believed in God, Jesus, and the Bible. So why were all of the important figures in the scientific revolution, from Copernicus all the way to Newton, why were they all Bible-believing theists? Coincidence is what stupid people think. But super smart people like Dr. Jordan Peterson take a closer look at the connection between the Bible and the scientific revolution.
Okay, so we start off with a really interesting question, and this is a question related to the nature and the origins of the scientific revolution. Now, the scientific revolution gets its start in the 15th century, most notably by people like Nicholas Copernicus, and is typically defined by the astronomical advances in science that took place from Copernicus to Galileo to Newton. That's generally what people are referring to when they're talking about the scientific revolution. So Dr. Wood poses this question related to the religious commitments of the individuals who participated, formed in the development of the scientific revolution. Why were they all Christian? Now, he's asking the question in this way, of course, for a particular reason, and that's going to be the claim that their Christianity, that their religious commitments had something to do with the development of modern science. Now, let me be very clear on this point. Christianity did influence the rise and the development of modern science in a very significant way. I'm not going to be disputing that claim. There is a tremendous amount of historical evidence for that claim. What I am going to be disputing is how apologists and people like Dr. Wood will take that a step further and claim that Christianity specifically, or that Christianity alone, or that the Judeo-Christian tradition specifically, not only played an important part in the development of modern science, but that modern science arose out of that tradition specifically. And as I've explained in other videos, I object to that point largely because I will argue that there are other influences beside the Judeo-Christian tradition that led to the development of modern science. And by other influences, I mean other religious traditions. So this is not something that's unique to Christianity per se, and it's not something I would argue that's even unique to Europe per se, although with the designator modern science, we are talking about the developments that happened in the 15th, 16th century Europe. So I stop it at this point because it's obvious to me that Dr. Wood's asking this question because he wants us to reach a specific conclusion, that conclusion being that it was their Christian beliefs that played some sort of important role in the development of modern science. But I think the phrasing and the framing of the question itself is incredibly misleading because of how reductionistic it is. And this is a problem that is, I think, rooted in the problem of historical reductionism. Now, history is an immensely complex subject, and anytime we're looking at or asking the question about why a particular historical event happened, the answer to that question is going to be incredibly complex. And the problem with reductionism is, I think, fundamental to a problem with the American education system in general, and that's that we tend to think of historical causes in the same way that we think of a multiple choice test, that there was one historical cause for a single historical event. And the problem with history is that is rarely the case. And it's certainly not the case when it comes to the rise and the development of modern science. But not only is historical reductionism a problem in the sense that it oversimplifies historical explanations, it's also a problem in that it can lead us to the wrong conclusions, lead us to false conclusions that misrepresent historical phenomena in general. So let me start off by giving a very quick, simple example of this that I've used in other videos. So oftentimes, to give you flashbacks to middle school history, I could ask you the question, what caused the American Civil War? And you might see this on a multiple choice question. A, states' rights. B, slavery. C, economic differences between the North and the South. D, political differences between the North and the South. And the problem with framing it as one of those options is that it doesn't give us the full historical picture. If you're looking at something as complex, for example, of why did the American Civil War happen, you're asking a question that literally goes back hundreds of years and involves all sorts of different aspects of American society, dating back really to the beginning of the American Revolution. Political differences between North and South, yes. Of course, the institution of slavery that inundated Southern culture since prior to the American Revolution. All of those play a factor in answering that question. Now, the problem with reductionism, as we see in lost cause narratives post-Civil War, is that if we reduce something like the Civil War to a single issue, the lost cause narrative says that that single issue was states' rights, then not only is that an oversimplification, but it's also a misrepresentation of history in order to prove a larger philosophical or ideological point. In the case of the lost cause narrative, is to downplay the tremendous negative impact that the institution of slavery had on the American population, as well as the African American population within the United States. In the case of the origins and development of modern science, to reduce that cause to Judeo-Christian values or to Christianity as a religion, is the rationale for that is to serve a larger ideological purpose, and that's to uphold the value, prestige, or rationality of Christianity as a religion. To say that Christianity gave rise to modern science is to value Christianity as an intellectual enterprise over and against other religious traditions. And that is exactly what I'm pushing back on with respect to this argument. That's not to say that the question itself doesn't hit at a truth, that truth being that a lot of the scientists who participated in the development of modern science in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries were indeed Christian. I'm not trying to deny that. But to phrase the question in that way is problematic because it ignores other cultural and historical issues that are at play. It would be very similar if I phrased the question in a different way, and if I asked the question, why were all of the early scientists of the scientific revolution men, for example? There are two problems with that question. One, it's historically false. There were, for example, many women who participated in the early scientific revolution, especially mathematicians like Maria Agassiz and Emily du Chardin, who contributed greatly to development of early science. But asking such a question is often serving the purpose of a larger philosophical point that the presenter might be trying to make. And that's to imply that because most of the scientists were men, that maybe there's something about men and their understanding or relationship to science that would make them somehow better at doing science than it would women, which ignores the cultural reason and the cultural basis for the question. That cultural basis being that women were simply not allowed in these positions, and generally speaking, weren't allowed in the universities, scientific laboratories of the day. So, yes, of course, most of the early scientists are going to be men. The same is true with posing it of Christianity. If we're limiting our geographical scope to Europe, then 99% of the people that we're talking about are going to be Christians. There were no other options unless you were part of the ethnic Jewish minority within Europe at the time, or unless you lived outside of 15th century Europe. So hopefully you can see how inherently problematic the question itself is. But even if we admit the fact that we're limiting ourselves to Europe, and even if we limit ourselves to the development of modern science, there's still this further claim that they were all Bible-believing Christians. And even this is an oversimplification. I mean, Dr. Wood even mentions this, that some of them were heretics. Now, it's not clear exactly what he means by heretic here, but in terms of Bible-believing Christians, this position kind of makes a monolith of 14th, 15th, and 16th century Christianity, which was undergoing major historical reforms, not only in the form of the Protestant Reformation, but in debates and conversations amongst Christians themselves, even about such fundamental doctrines such as the idea of the Trinity. And probably, not even probably, without a doubt, the most famous example of this comes in the form of the most prominent scientist of the early scientific revolution, and that was Isaac Newton. Now, Newton was, of course, a Christian, but whether or not Newton was a quote unquote Orthodox Christian depends entirely upon what your definition of orthodoxy is. And whether or not Newton was a Bible believing Christian also highly depends on what you mean by that. And the reason why I bring this up, for example, is because specifically within England in the 16th, 15th, and 16th century, there's a movement of anti-Trinitarian thought of which Newton was a part. So Newton famously did not hold to a Nicene version of Christianity, in that he didn't uphold the what would now be the Orthodox position that the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are of one substance. So Newton was not a strict monotheist in that regard. And I have some quotes here that are taken from some of the correspondences of Newton. These were made available in the early 20th century. I think it was in the 1930s that we found all of these manuscripts that were written by Newton. Newton actually wrote more about religion and the Bible than he did about physics. But Newton had this to say with respect to the Trinity. The heathens and the Gnostics suppose not only their gods, but even the souls of men and the stars to be of one substance. This is referring back to the Arian controversy of the early church, to be of one substance with the supreme God, and yet were idlers for worshiping them. And he that is of this opinion may believe Christ to be of one substance with the Father, without making him more than a mere man. 'Tis not consubstantially, but power and dominion which gives a right to be worshipped, the right of Jesus to be worshiped. So it's not that he's of equal substance with the Father that gives him that right, but of the dominion that Jesus has. And therefore, as a father and a son cannot be called one king upon account of their being consubstantial, but may be called one king by unity of dominion if the son be viceroy under the Father. So God and his son cannot be called one God upon account of their being consubstantial. So Newton held to the position posited by people in the ancient church, such as Arius, that God and Jesus were not the same entity, were not the same person, so to speak, were not of the same substance, but that Jesus was given dominion by God, and that this is what the Trinity is referring to, not one and three, but really three separate entities. So Newton was not a strict Trinitarian. Now, I point this out to point at the fact that Christianity, by the time that the development of the scientific revolution rolls around, is not a monolith. Now, it's not as religiously diverse, for example, as the United States is today, where you have all these different religious traditions occupying the same area. Most of these people are without a doubt Christian, but what exactly we mean by Bible-believing Christian, they may not fit that strict definition, is what I want to point out here. Okay, so let's continue on in the video, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here.
But the other Francis Schaeffer, continues. Therefore, science as science and art as art was understood to be, in the best sense, a religious activity. Science was a religious activity? Notice in the quotation the fact that Francis Bacon did not see science as autonomous. It's not independent of God and revelation, for it was placed within the revelation of the scriptures at the point of the fall. Yet within that form, science and art was free and of intrinsic value before both men and God. The early scientists also shared the outlook of Christianity in believing that there is a reasonable God who had created a reasonable universe, and thus man, by use of his reason, could find out the universe's form. Now we're starting to get a more complete picture. The world was created by a reasonable God. So we can understand the universe by means of reason.
Okay, so Dr. Wood here is quoting from Francis Schaeffer about the nature of science and religion. Now, I wouldn't disagree with the claim that a lot of the early practitioners of the scientific revolution viewed science as an inherently religious practice or a part of their religious practice, in the sense that a lot of these people were utilizing the natural sciences as a means of understanding not only the divine work of creation, but also understanding attributes of God himself, as would be the case with Newton in his conception of absolute time and space. But we have the further claim here, said by Schaeffer, that the early scientists also shared the outlook of Christianity in believing that there is a reasonable God who had created a reasonable universe, and that it was that theological commitment that led to the development of modern science. Now, again, that may be partially true, but I don't think that it's exclusively true. So let me offer a couple of objections there. The first is the objection to the fact that that claim is needed to get science off the ground. So one of the roots of the development of modern science, I think, would undoubtedly be the Greek natural philosophers. I don't really know of anybody who would argue against that claim, since if you look at the work of these other early scientists, they are littered with references to Greek philosophy. Modern science itself is largely a reaction to medieval Aristotelian philosophy, cosmology, physics, biology that was sort of entrenched in Europe by the 10th and 11th century. So the Greeks are going to play a major, major role in the development of modern science, arguably as equally as important a role as Christianity, but we'll come back to that point. Did the Greeks have this theological commitment? Some people would argue that they did not. The Greeks, of course, were famously polytheistic. Some of their gods were certainly reasonable, but we also get a lot of bickering and infighting amongst the Greek gods. They're not reasonable in the sense that the Christian God is portrayed to be. So whether or not this theological commitment is necessary to the development of modern science, well, it certainly seems that the Greeks were a major precursor to the development of modern science. They didn't share this theological commitment. The second objection would be that this idea that this commitment is somehow unique to Christianity. My biggest problem with apologists who make this claim is that in all of these videos that I have seen, not once do they mention the influence of Islam, for example. So is Christianity the only religion that made this claim that influenced the development of modern science? Well, even if we take this theological claim to be central and fundamental to the development of modern science, it's not unique to Christianity. Islam also made this claim, and Islam also paved the way for the development of modern science. Arguably, without Islam, we wouldn't get modern science. But let's continue on, because he's going to build off of this to make some other claims here about these assumptions being necessary for the development of science.
These tremendous contributions, which we take for granted, we sure do, don't we? Launched early modern science. It would be a very real question if the scientists of today, who function without these assurances and motivations, would or could have ever begun modern science. Nature had to be freed from the Byzantine mentality and returned to a proper biblical emphasis. And it was the biblical mentality which gave birth to modern science. Interesting question. Could the scientists of today, if they didn't already know what they know, and they were transported back in time to replace the Christian pioneers of the scientific revolution, could they have begun modern science? In other words, if you didn't already believe that the universe had a reasonable creator who created a reasonable universe, and that man, created in the image of God, can understand the universe through reason, would science ever get off the ground? You might say, yes, we would have eventually figured out things regardless. But if that's what you're thinking, you haven't yet understood how massive this problem is. You're suffering from what's called the curse of knowledge.
Okay, so are these theological assumptions necessary? And let's get rid of the moniker of modern science. Let's just say science in general. Do we have to have these theological commitments in order to get to science? Again, those theological commitments being unique to Christianity of a reasonable God who created a reasonable universe. Now, all of this depends on what you mean by reasonable God and what you mean by reasonable universe. But let's just assume for a second that what Schaeffer and what Dr. Wood means that by that is a theological position or worldview that is similar to Christianity. Now, do you need that to get science? I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so is simply the historical fact that scientific enterprises, now this hinges largely on how you define science. I define science in a very broad sense as a collective body of knowledge that's embodied in, typically speaking, state run institutions that survives from one generation to the next, in which that knowledge is passed down. Now, if you take that very broad definition of science, then yes, science has appeared in cultures that do not roughly, loosely share those theological commitments because it's appeared in places like ancient China, ancient India, ancient Africa, and ancient Mesoamerica, for example. Now, there are certain basic metaphysical assumptions of science, which might be what Dr. Wood's getting at. Some of those assumptions of science will be that the future will resemble the past. Assumptions about the nature of cause and effect, that if I do A, then B will happen. Like, yes, some of those commitments are required, but the commitment of a reasonable God, I don't think is necessarily required. If we look at a science such as medicine, which has been practiced across the globe for as long as human beings have been on this earth. Now, medical knowledge, medicine is a science that's based on a complex blend of deductive and inductive reasoning, pattern recognition, and evidence-based practices. Now, part of that pattern recognition is the assumption that the past patterns that we have observed will look like future patterns that we have observed. But even if you just grant those things, which I don't think require some sort of theological commitment to a rational deity, then we could get medicine off the ground. Because basically all you need is observation, there also assuming cause and effect, and the formulation of testable hypotheses based off those observation. If I give this person this plant, it's going to cause that result. So could science develop without those assumptions? I think so, because I think that it has on multiple different occasions and multiple different places developed without those assumptions. Now, in the video that he reviews from Dr. Peterson, it's going to take that a step further. So I want to go ahead and get into that here now.
Here we are. Dr. Peterson's documentary is called Logos and Literacy because much of it deals with how the Bible spread literacy. And there's an obvious connection between the spread of literacy and the spread of science.
Why didn't modern science develop in China? Why didn't it develop in India? Why did it develop in Europe? And why did these men come after 16th, particularly 17th century? Why not in the 15th century?
Excellent questions that no one ever bothers to ask.
This printing of this book changes everything because it begins an intellectual revolution that now, if this is God's word, this has to reform our minds.
Okay, so yes, we actually do have a very interesting question here, although I would fundamentally disagree with Dr. Wood here when he said that no one has bothered to ask. A lot of people have bothered to ask. This is one of the biggest questions in the history of science and is formulated in what has become known as the Needham question. Now, Joseph Needham was a British biochemist, historian of science, a little bit of a polymath who specialized in the history of science with respect to Chinese history. And Needham became famous for posing this very question. This is how Needham formulated the question. Why did modern science, mathematicalization of hypotheses about nature with all its implications for advanced technology, take its meteoric rise only in the West at the time of Galileo? So why did what we call the scientific revolution not happen in China? Sort of a counterfactual question. And the basis for this question, the reason why it's so perplexing, is actually, if you look at 15th century China versus 15th century Europe, for example, China was economically and scientifically way more advanced. Needham kind of points to this in a further quote concerning the early philosopher Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, according to Needham, had selected 3 inventions: paper and printing, gunpowder, and the magnetic compass, which had done more than anything else, he thought, to transform completely the modern world and mark it off from the antiquity of the Middle Ages. He regarded these inventions as obscure and inglorious, and he died without ever knowing that all of them were Chinese. So some of the most pivotal and fundamental pieces of technology that led to the development of the scientific revolution have their origins in China. So why was it that Europe and not China underwent what we today call the scientific revolution? Now, this is unfortunately one of those questions of history that we don't have a great answer for, and that historians are going to actually give different answers for. The simple answer is that there is no simple answer, that there is a tremendous confluence of factors that led to the origins and development of the scientific revolution, when it happened, 14th, 15th, 16th century, and where it happened in Europe as opposed to it happening in other places. Was Christianity one of those factors? For sure it was. Undoubtedly it was. But were there other factors? Again, we want to avoid historical reductionism. Of course, there were other factors. Let's look at what some of those other potential factors could have been. Now, there is a major factor that is often ignored in these discussions, and that is probably one of the most important historical driving forces of all time. And what I'm talking about, of course, is money. We have a similar sort of question. This is put forward by Niall Ferguson, a historian, in his book Civilization, the West and the Rest. And he points to another big question of history, which is called by historians as the Great Divergence. It's a closely related question. Why did Europe, starting in the 15th century, pull away from, economically speaking, all of these other places in the world? This is how Ferguson phrases the question. Why, beginning around 1500, did a few small polities of on the western end of the Eurasian landmass come to dominate the west of the world, both economically, militarily, and imperially? How did that happen? How can we explain that? And I'm linking these two questions together to show you that, yes, we are talking about intellectual influence, and we can point to intellectual influences such as Christianity, but we can also point to concrete economic influences such as the expansion of European power as one of the driving forces of science. Because one of the hallmarks of Western science is the marriage of science and technology in a way that we have never seen before. And the driving force of technological development is going to be capital. How can we make money off of this is probably one of the most important questions, is what's going to be leading and driving technological development in Europe. We see this in the form of the navigation technology, not only the improvements on compass technology, but shipbuilding itself, the taking of gunpowder technology from China, applying that to the naval technology, putting cannons on board ships, making cannons more mobile, the cartography, the map-making technology that results from the European explorers going to other places outside of Europe. Why are they going to other places outside of Europe? It's to find new trade routes to those Eastern markets. All of this stuff is kind of intimately connected with each other. And all of this will explain the rapid development of science, because you have to remember that science in the 15th century is no different from science in the 21st century, in the sense that research, writing, all requires a tremendous amount of time, research, manpower-based investment that is simply not possible without funding. So, for example, David Londes, in his article, Why Europe and the West, Why Not China?, explains that the reason for the divergence between Europe and China has to largely do with that age of exploration. This is what Londes says. 500 years later, the tables had turned. I like to summarize the change in one telltale event: the Portuguese penetration into the Indian Ocean led by Vasco da Gama in 1498. The importance of European exploration is that Europe in the latter part of the 15th and 16th century would benefit tremendously, not only economically as a result of economic expansion into Eastern markets, but also because of the technology and intellectual inheritance that they would get. Londes goes on to say, I shall return later to this revisionist. Here suffices to say are the reasons. Number one, the Portuguese success was the result of decades of rational exploration and extension of navigational possibilities in an ocean, the South Atlantic, that was hostile to traditional techniques of navigation, which essentially involved following the coastline. The technological enhancement rested in turn on a systematic utilization of astronomical observations and calculations taken from the Muslims and transmuted largely by Jewish intermediaries, which allowed the Portuguese to follow the winds and currents across the South Atlantic and then use knowledge of latitude to swing back around the tip of Africa into the Indian Ocean. Two, the Chinese abandonment of westward exploration was partly the result of contingent political events, but at the bottom it reflected the values and structures of Chinese society and civilization. Three, European exploration of the breakthrough rested on a disparity of power technology, better powder and better guns, as well as on navigational superiority. So again, a combination of economics, Portuguese expansion into the Eastern markets, technology, the improvement upon cannon technology, but also the intellectual inheritance that was only made possible by this expansion of Muslim astronomical knowledge that allowed the navigation in the first place. Scott Montgomery, in his article, Why Did Modern Science Emerge in Europe? An essay in intellectual history, expands on this idea of the intellectual inheritance that Europe got in the 15th century. Montgomery has this to say: China, India, Persia, ancient Greeks, the lands of Islam, and those of the Inca, Maya, Aztec societies in the New World all developed extraordinarily scientific communities rooted in understanding of the natural world. Thus, European scholars came to benefit directly from early Islam's historical worlds, as we might say, an unparalleled center of scientific, medical, and engineering knowledge. The expansion of Europe opened up Europe to the access of these other scientific communities, not just Islam, but in the New World. He later goes to point out in the article advancements in medical technology that was inherited from the contact with these civilizations. And just to show you the diversity of opinion among historical research, here we have another article, Survival of the Weakest, Why the Rest Rules, in which they say that the major reason of the break from the West over and against other parts of the world comes from two things. This is what they have to say. Our contention is that the reason that the West rules can be traced back to two events, both taking place in China: the invention of the cannon, which made possible the survival of the weakest in Europe, and the arrival of Genghis Khan, which led to the survival of the strongest in China. So again, more cultural, political, militarily influences that are going to lead to the development and rise of modern science, the pulling away of Europe in the 15th and 16th century, the rise of colonialization. All of these factors are going to contribute to the development of modern science, when it happened and where it happened. So I say that to say that ultimately I'm going to agree with what the historian of science Ronald Numbers says. Numbers says, quote, despite the manifest shortcomings of the claim that Christianity gave birth to science, most glaringly it ignores or minimizes the contributions of ancient Greeks and medieval Muslims. It is a historically simplistic explanation that ignores other influences and factors. It ignores economic influences, political influences, other cultural influences. But most importantly, it presents a Eurocentric picture of history that minimizes the influence of non-Europeans on the development of modern science. Now, that's all I got for this video. I will probably review the rest of the video in another one of my videos. I didn't want to make this too long. I could probably spend a couple of hours talking about this. I'll leave it there for today, but I look forward to hearing what your responses to this question, to this problem would be in the comment section below. And as always, I will see you all next time.